What if I told you that a 2,400-year-old war, fought with literally just wooden ships and bronze spears, perfectly explains the incredibly complex, often terrifying global headlines we're reading today? Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're tracing the undeniable, hardwired patterns of human power, jumping from ancient city-states straight into modern nuclear standoffs. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start by defining realism, then untangle the Peloponnesian web, look at some ancient dialogues and decrees, and then fast forward to modern geopolitics, domestic power struggles, and wrap up with the very nature of power itself. All right, Section 1, Defining Political Realism. Our source material anchors its whole analysis on this really powerful quote from political theorist Hans J. Morgenthau. He basically asserts that human nature, it hasn't changed since the days of classical philosophy. So despite our smartphones and satellites and all this advanced tech, it turns out we haven't actually evolved much at all. The underlying psychology of power, of fear and survival, it remains exactly the same as it was thousands of years ago. So what actually is political realism? Well, the source defines it as this almost paranoiac concern of nations to preserve their autonomy, their territory, and their power using absolutely any means necessary. Now, you've got two distinct flavors here. You've got classical realism, which calculates national interest and prudence, so it still allows for some degree of moral judgment. But then there's radical, or extreme realism. This version completely throws morality out the window. It claims that all means, whether moral or totally immoral, are completely justified if they achieve the desired political end. And this extreme realism, that's exactly what we're going to see play out next. Section 2, the Peloponnesian Web, focusing on ancient alliances. Now, mapping out these ancient Greek city-states reveals a really delicate, highly paranoid balance of power. On one side, you've got the Peloponnesian League, and that's led by the land superpower, Sparta, alongside its ally Corinth. Then on the other side, you've got the Delian League, led by the naval superpower Athens. And caught right in the middle are these smaller, neutral states like Epidamnus and Milos. Thucydides argues that the deepest cause of this massive war wasn't some grand ideology. It was simply human fear of someone else's growing power. Just look at this domino effect. It started over Epidamnus, a wealthy city that asked Corinth for help. Corcyra felt threatened by this, so they attacked Corinth. Then, fearing retaliation, Corcyra broke its neutrality and allied with Athens. Athens agreed, mostly hoping to keep Corinth's naval strength in check. Well, Corinth was furious and ran straight to Sparta. Ultimately, Sparta declared war on Athens, not out of some noble sense of justice, but just because they feared the unchecked growth of Athenian power. Basically, local squabbles dragged the world's superpowers into total war. Sounds a little too familiar, right? Section 3, Dialogues and Decrees. Looking at ancient extremes. Let's look at the military approach first, with the Melian Dialogue. Melos was the small, completely neutral island. Out of nowhere, Athens shows up with an overwhelming military force and essentially demands that they submit and become a tributary colony. The Melians, they pleaded for justice, for morality, hoping the gods would protect their freedom. And the Athenians? They just dropped all pretense. They explicitly stated that out in the real world, right and wrong are only ever in question between equals in power. The Athenians delivered this truly chilling statement. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. I mean, that is extreme realism in action. Power entirely eclipses morality. And the conclusion for Milos was absolutely devastating. When they refused to surrender, Athens conquered them, executed all the grown men, and sold women and children into slavery. A brutally stark proof of the Athenian stance. But realism isn't always about physical violence. Enter the Megarian Decree. Athens essentially slapped a total economic embargo on Megara, which was a Spartan ally. Megarians were completely banished from Athenian land, their markets, and their seas. The whole goal here was to slowly starve the Megarian economy and prove to Spartan allies that Athens could destroy them without ever firing a single weapon or technically breaking their peace treaty with Sparta. It was a brilliant, ruthless shift from physical bloodshed right into economic strangulation. Section 4. Realism in modern geopolitics. Mapping out the modern Middle East, the source draws some incredibly direct neutral parallels. In one corner, we see Israel, backed by the global superpower of the US, which the source explicitly compares to Athens backing its allies. Then, to the east, adversaries like Iran face severe economic sanctions. The source notes Iran's view that these sanctions are specifically designed to prevent it from reaching prominent status, a classic realist move by a superpower to limit a rising state. Meanwhile, you have North Korea acquiring nuclear weapons explicitly for regime survival, basically using that massive threat to keep larger powers at bay. So, the Megarian Decree? It is alive and well today. Modern superpowers use these exact same economic levers to impose their will. The source points to U.S. economic sanctions on Iran and North Korea to force changes in their nuclear policies. It also highlights how the U.S. has cut aid, or threatened to cut aid, to nations like Uganda and Nigeria as leverage over domestic cultural laws regarding homosexuality. Regardless of the actual issue at hand, the mechanism is exactly the same. The strong using economic power to dictate terms to the less powerful. 14,000. That is the approximate number of nuclear weapons held by the United States and Russia today. That represents over 90% of the global arsenal. And the source points out a truly fascinating parallel here. Just as Athens and Sparta were allies who successfully fought off the Persian invasion together, only to turn into paranoid mortal enemies, the US and the Soviet Union were allies who defeated Nazi Germany together, only to plunge almost immediately into the Cold War, driven purely by a mutual fear of the other's power. Section 5. Domestic Power Struggles, or Internal Realism. The source examines the Nigerian Civil War as a prime example of domestic political realism. In January 1966, a military coup raised these intense fears of tribal domination. And this exact fear, the sheer terror of another group gaining too much power, led directly to a retaliatory counter-coup in July. This spiraling paranoia over dominance ultimately triggered the Biafran secession and a deeply tragic civil war. It's essentially the Peloponnesian domino effect, just played out domestically. We also see this in political godfatherism. The source specifically cites the power struggles between established Nigerian leaders like former President Obasanjo and Atiku Abubakar. In this intensely realist environment, power is fiercely hoarded. Younger politicians often literally cannot achieve office unless they submit and act as stooges to these older, much more powerful political godfathers. Power is granted, for sure, but only through total submission to a stronger force. Section 6. The Nature of Power. After examining the bloodshed of ancient Greece, the Cold War, modern economic sanctions, and domestic coups, the source arrives at a pretty bleak conclusion. The reason we can't easily escape these conflicts is due to the inherent nature of man, which constantly drives him to want to be the master of the other. This drive for dominance is just hardwired into our makeup, and that explains exactly why the patterns established in 431 BCE continue to dictate the headlines we're reading this very morning. Which leaves us with this final, genuinely provocative question. If Morgenthau and Thucydides are right, and this paranoiac drive for dominance really is hardwired into human nature, can we ever truly escape the rules of the Peloponnesian War? Or are we destined to just keep inventing shiny new technologies to fight the exact same battles? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope this helps you see the world just a little bit more clearly.